Today's topic is the Kashering, of cheese equipment. Now, some of the equipment we're going to talk about is used in other industries as well, but making cheese uses, we're going to mention a handful of different things that are a little bit unusual. So whether you need to kasher them and how to kasher them is a little bit different, is a little less obvious. So we're going to be talking about these different things. Again, they can apply to other industries as well. And the first is the cheese tanks. So we start by saying that cheese that's made without a Jewish person participating is also, it's called gvinas akum. But in many cases, cheese is set at below yatzel. The word set means that this means when you put in the rennet and cause the cheese, the curd part of it, to separate from what's called the whey, and that's what your cheese is. So if it was set below yatzel, so the cheese would, if it was made without a Jewish person participating, the cheese would still be asur. But we assume that the vat is not absorbing any of that non-kosher tam because it's below yatzel, and that's not so unusual that cheeses would be set at below yatzel. So the working assumption would be it was below yatzel, so the tank that it was made in didn't become non-kosher. We cannot use it for kosher cheese. So the question to that is that the way they keep the temperature in this tank, let's say the temperature is set at 118 degrees Fahrenheit, which is below our cutoff of 120. The way they keep it that hot, exactly at that temperature, is because there's steam in the jacket. Well, the steam is 250 degrees. So shouldn't we think that, if the steam is 250 and the tank is 118 degrees, what about the fact that some of the cheese right alongside the walls of the right near the steam jacket is below yatzel? I mean, wouldn't you think that if the middle of the tank is getting to 118 and the walls are 250, or what's on the other side of the wall is 250, sure, it would seem like that there would the product that's alongside the walls is above yatzel, and should cause a problem of it being making bleas go into. So Rav Schechter thought that this is a case that was spoken about in the Shach, that the Shach speaks about a pot which is on the fire where the food doesn't get to be yatzel display, which is like our case where there's, so to speak, a fire. There's something causing a lot of heat over here. The overall food is not getting to be yatzel display, but again, the thought is that what's along the edges maybe is getting yatzel, maybe it's not. So the Shach is inclined to be mekel. He personally thinks that you do not have to worry about bleas in that case, but he says others who are machmir, and therefore he wants to follow. He says you should follow the machmirim. But the Pri Megadim, bringing from Minchas Yaakov, says this, that he's machmir is only to say is that tam transfers from the pot into the food. Okay, bikli l'oichel. But there's nothing. You don't have to be choshesh that tam is transferring from one food to another food in that circumstance. Nor do you have to worry about tam transferring from the food into the pot. Okay, so Rav Schechter said, in our case, when they make the non-kosher cheese at below yatzel, there the concern is that tam would go from the cheese into the pot, from the oichel kli, and in that case, we don't have to worry about that. Even though it's on the fire, and presumably at that part it's very hot, you don't have to be worried about that. Okay, so that's where Rav Schechter thought you could be mekel. However, even so, there is a case that you have to be machmir, and that is, this is the point Rav Schechter is making is based on the way this Pri Megadim understands the Shach. His point is that we don't have to worry about tam being transferred from the treif cheese into the walls of the tank. We would be worried about tam coming the other direction from the walls back into the cheese. Well, there is a case like that, because what happens if the company had previously made a treif cheese that was above yatzel display? So they made Parmesan cheese, which is set at above yatzel display. So then the tank is treif. Then that tank for sure became treif. It wasn't this part of our question. Once the tank is already treif, now to make kosher cheese below yatzel display, now the blia has to come from the tank into the cheese. That the Pri Megadim is saying that we should be concerned, based on the Shach is saying we should be concerned about tam coming that way. So in that case, the vat would have to be kasher, even though the kosher cheese never gets to be yatzel display. Since the treif cheese does get to be yatzel display, it makes the tank it's called the double O. The tank makes it treif, and therefore we would have to kasher it before making it for cheese, which is below yatzel display. Now, this issue is not so common because companies tend to be making the same cheeses again and again, and the people who make below yatzel display or above, they sort of stick to what they're doing. But it definitely could come up, and it's worth bearing in mind. Okay, now the next thing is that just about every kind of cheese has salt added to it to draw out the whey and the lactose out of it, some of the moisture. It helps preserve it. It adds some flavor to it. So most of the times the salt is added in a process called dry salting, which means you pour salt over the curd. The curd is what will be the cheese before it's put into the mold. Okay, so when you make cheese, the put in the rennet, and that causes the curd to float to the top. The curd is like this soft, mushy, white stuff. I don't know what you call it. It looks like curd. And what you do is you then squeeze out all the whey out of it and put it into a mold where there it hardens into the shape of a wheel or a block or however, the shape that you want the cheese to be in. So dry salting is you put salt into it before you put it into the mold. Now, that's one kind of salting. The other kind is there are certain kinds of cheeses that are fancier, like string cheese and Parmesan. They are brine salted, which means is once you already have the cheese in the mold, it's already molded and it has its shape to it, then you put it into this pool of very salty water, brine. You put it into this very salty water, and it sits, the whole wheel, the whole block of cheese sits in there it could be for a couple of minutes, or it could be for days or weeks, or for a very long time also. Okay, and that's a different kind of brining used for, it's called brine salting for a fancier kind of cheeses. Now, the most obvious issue with brine salting is if this liquid brine that the cheese sits in is used again and again. They could use it for years. They just put in cheese into it. After the cheese is finished brining, they take it out and put in the next bunch of cheese. So obviously, if we're going to be making kosher cheese, we need to switch the brine. Take out the old brine and put in a new batch for the kosher cheese. Now, another thing is that brine is called, we call that tzir. And tzir creates kavush in a very short amount of time. And we say it's somewhere between 6 and 18 minutes. Which means, in other words, it doesn't take 24 hours for brine to become kavush. So that means is, let's say someone's making string cheese, and so that starts off with mozzarella cheese, and you put it through a brine tank for a short amount of time. Now, it won't sit there for 24 hours, but if it sits there even for a couple of minutes, between 6 to 18 minutes, it sits there for a short amount of time, it will cause kavush, which will cause bleeds to go in and out from the tank to the cheese and the other way around. So you'd have to make sure that tank was kashered. Now, a lot of these tanks that are used for brining, brining are hard to kasher. First of all, because they're not built for handling heat. That's many of them. There's also typically no access to hot water in those places, and both of those are potentially possible to overcome. But what makes it extra complicated is that some of these brine tanks are made of cement. Cement is a type of cheres, and it can't be kasher with hagala at all. Okay, so a lot of times, for one of these different reasons, it's not really possible to kasher the brine tanks. So instead, what people will do is they line the brine tank. I mean, they take the treif brine out of the tank and put a lining into it. And when they're really big, they use a swimming pool liner, it's called, which is, like it sounds like it's a liner for going on the inside of a swimming pool. So it's nice and big and thick and plastic. And the point there is, then the kosher cheese is really brining in the liner rather than brining inside the tank. And it has no contact with the tank itself. You have to just be careful when you do this to make sure that there's no liquid between the tank and the liner, because if that were to happen, then it would help time transfer from the tank into the liner into the cheese also. Okay, so that's about the kashering of those brine tanks. And just sort of an aside is that when cheese gets brined for a long time, so it's not just like they dunk the cheese into the brine and then just leave it there and don't do anything with it for weeks and weeks on end. Actually, what happens is that the cheese needs to be turned to make sure that it stays under the water line. Excuse me. What happens is the cheese floats, so some of the cheese will be sticking out of the water, out of the brine. So it has to be turned every couple of days. So the factory needs to turn their cheeses, or else they won't come out right. The mashgiach wants to make sure that the cheeses are locked up or sealed so that no one switches treif for kosher. Make sure that the cheeses stay separate the way they're supposed to be. So we have a conflict over here. The mashgiach needs it to be locked up. The company people need access to the cheese to do the turning. So sometimes that means that the Mashiach has to keep coming back. Every time they want to turn it, they'll call him back, if that's feasible. Sometimes that's not so feasible for him to be right there every time they want to do that, and they'll use video or other types of way to monitor that he can keep an eye when they actually have to get into the room to make that changing. One last thing is that there is a shaila whether the idea of melech k'reseach, that something salted has a din like it's hot, means that you have to kasher drain tables. When you dump out the brine cheese after it's over, you dump out this cheese onto a tank, onto a table, and the brine drains away from it. There's a question whether melech k'reseach applies to that. That's not too complicated for today, but there is such a question whether those drainage tables need to be kasher. Okay, moving on to cheese wires, and they are once you have your blocks of cheese that are ready, they're ready to go, they're finished. The way you slice them is by pushing the cheese through these very thin, taut, strong wires, and so by pushing the cheese through it, the wires are really tight and strong, and pushing cheese through slices it into what we're used to, sliced cheese. Now it's done at room temperature, and even so, you need to kash them. You have to kash them anyhow, and the reason is because if you use some kind of a utensil, let's say a plate with cold food, or food that's ambient temperature, then you don't need to do any hot kind of kashering. You just have to make sure it's really clean very well. However, an exception to that rule is that if you use a knife to cut something not kosher, then you need to kash. You don't need to clean it just by cleaning it like we usually do. You need to do a better cleaning called ne'itza. Ne'itza. And that's really what's going on over here. The cheese is essentially being cut by the wires. Now, instead of the wire pushing through the cheese is pushing through the wire, but it's the same idea, that the cheese is being sliced by this, so to speak, by the wire. So it needs ne'itza. Okay, what's ne'itza? It means the way you're supposed to do ne'itza is you take the knife and you stick it into something that's into very hard, tightly packed dirt, not too tight, but relatively hard, tightly packed dirt 10 times, each one into a different spot. And the idea is, either some place can say what it does is it takes off the film of residue that might be stuck onto the knife, or maybe it takes a certain amount of time that's below into the knife. But that's what you're supposed to do. You take the knife, go into the backyard, stick it into the hard dirt 10 times, to relatively hard dirt 10 times, and that's the cleaning that you need to do, called ne'itza, when you use the knife to cut something that was not kosher. Now, this method of kashering, called ne'itza, doesn't come from Torah. It's not a pasuk. Chazal are saying it based on their just understanding that the way knives are used and the way knives are either get grease stuck onto them or a little bit of bleed into them, and the rules of Kabbalah Kachpata tells you the knife tells you that since the knife pushed through the tray food, we kasher by pushing it through the ground, by pushing it into the ground also. Okay, so Poskim assume that this is not a gzeres hakasa. This is something that's, so to speak, logical. So if we can obtain the same goal in a different way, that'll do the trick also. Even though you didn't do the technicalities of ne'itza. And our case is a really good example of that, because these wires are functioning as knives, but it's obviously physically impossible to do ne'itza. You couldn't possibly push them into the ground, thrust them into the ground in a way that would get them clean. You could stick them in the ground. That's not going to do anything. So what we do is they're not strong enough, tough enough, solid enough to be pushed into the ground with any kind of force. So what we do is we do a reverse ne'itza. Okay, ne'itza usually is we push the knife into something abrasive. The soil is abrasive and it cleans off the knife, or it draws out the bleia from that thin layer inside of it. That's ne'itza. So in this case, what we do the opposite. We take something abrasive like steel wool, and we push or scrub it over the knife until it gets it as clean as it would have gotten when through an ne'itza. So we're doing a reverse ne'itza, so to speak. But it's the same idea. Again, the point is that this is a logical way of cleaning, and we're just doing a little different method of it, which is what Chazal would have been happy with. Some people even say you could just use soap and modern CIP methods, because they're just as good also. even without abrasives. But the simpler way to do it, the simpler halachic way to do it, is just to use the abrasive right on the wires themselves, and that's considered kashering. Okay, and our last thing to talk about is a shrink tunnel, and that is that some cheese gets packaged in these special, we'll call them bags, and what they are is they put the cheese into the bag, close the bag up, and then they heat them until the bag shrinks. It sort of melts the bag, and it shrinks and fits snugly around the cheese. There's two ways to heat up these bags. One is, well, there's a third way, but there's two main ways to heat it up. And one is you put it through after the cheese is in the bag, you put it through a tunnel where hot water pours on it. And the other choice is that it goes through a bath of hot water. Okay, those are two different ways to heat up these, to heat the bag so that it'll shrink and it'll wrap tightly around the cheese. So the question is, does time transfer between the cheese and the water? When either the water pouring on it or the water bath, does it transfer onto it? So in the hot tunnel where the water's pouring on it, it seems like it sounds like irreclusion. Okay, we have hot water pouring onto a cold bag of cheese, and the blia should be kedei klipa. If that was correct, then we wouldn't have a problem, because blias through Iri only go kedei klipa. Well, the bag itself is that thickness of a kedei klipa. So even if the tunnel would be not kosher because there's grease in it and all kinds of cheeses in it, it wouldn't affect the cheese. It couldn't possibly affect the cheese. But the truth is, the tunnel, the way it's constructed with all this hot water pouring, it ends up having the status of something called hevel hakadera, which is to say is that the chamber where the cheeses pass through on a belt is so filled with steam that it's like the headspace in a pot. And the headspace in a pot is considered like a klirishin, not iri anymore. It's considered like a klirishin, and blias would go through all the way through. Now, the other choice, where the cheese is submerged in a hot bath, it seems like a case of which is say when you put something cold into something hot. The din is we go tato gavar, which means to say is since the lower one, the base one is a hot one, it heats up the thing that's above it and causes blias to transfer completely through it. Okay, so that's on the simple understanding. There's a lot of other complications, but let's work with the simple understanding that that's a plain case of tato gavar. When something cold falls on something hot, blia goes through completely, and on top of that, it's worth bearing in mind that in order for the bags to shrink, they have to be about 190 degrees. So that means to say is the bag actually is quite hot. The cheese doesn't get hot, but that has the rule of tato gavar, that the thing underneath is the base thing is hot. The thing that's above it is also assumed to be hot, and therefore time transfers to it. So both types of these shrink tunnels need to be kashered. What you got to do is you'll have to drain out the water. So we don't use the tray for water for kosher cheese. Clean the equipment well, and then do hagala. Sometimes hagala is not so possible, or not so realistic, or maybe any ben is not possible. So what they'll do is the kosher people will just basically make their own bath. They'll take a tank or a kettle and fill it up with hot water, and then just dump every bag into them by themselves, and that'll cause it to shrink without using the official shrink tunnel that was meant for that.